I'd like to introduce tonight's first speaker, Dr. Cayleih Robertson. Cayleih is a comparative physiologist who completed her PhD work with Grant McClellan here at McMaster University. She hails from the East Coast near the Bay of Fundy, which I will point out has the highest tides in the world. She studies how baby animals and their moms cope with their environment, whether they live in the depths of the ocean or on the summits of the Rocky Mountains. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Cayleih Robertson.
Thanks so much for that introduction, Joe. And thank you everyone for taking this opportunity to be here with us today. We're all really excited to get the chance to share our research and our passions with all of you. Before we get started, I want everyone just to take a moment and think about a part of our bodies that we don't often like to consider, which is our body fat. And I want you to try and come up with one good thing that your body fat does for you. You can put it in the chat of the webinar if you want to, or you can just say it to your pet or your partner, whoever's watching this with you, or just think it to yourself. And if you can't think of anything at all, that's okay, because today we're going to talk about 3 secrets that your fat is keeping from you, and what this little tiny mouse of all things can teach us about how to unravel those mysteries. So when we talk about fat, what do we actually mean? We're usually talking about adipose tissue, which is a connective tissue that is all around our body that contains adipocyte cells. And these cells store excess energy from the food that we eat in the form of triglycerides. When we need that energy later to do something like exercise, those triglycerides get broken down into fuel that can be used by our metabolically active tissues like our muscle. And this is a really important adaptation for us and for all kinds of different animals because it allows us to carry an energy-dense fuel source on our bodies all the time. It's sort of like going for a hike and having a backpack full of snacks. Now, for a really long time, a lot of scientists thought that this was really the only job aside from insulation that fat had. And it's probably what came to mind when I asked you the question at the beginning of this talk. But we now know that fat is much more complicated than this, and there's many different types of fat that does different jobs. I study what's known as brown adipose tissue, which has these brown adipocyte cells, and they don't store energy to use later. They burn energy in order to produce heat. Now, this heat-producing brown fat is one of the things that's unique to placental mammals, just like us. And it was first discovered a long time ago in 1551 in this angry little fellow, marmots. But it took an embarrassingly long 400 years for us to figure out what brown fat actually does. And the reason it took so long is because marmots are hibernators. And so we thought that brown fat was just some weird thing to help with hibernation. And it does help hibernators. It allows them to heat up their vital organs like their brains and their hearts and their lungs first when they're waking up out of their hibernation state where their body temperature is really low. But it's useful for a lot of other things aside from hibernation. It's particularly helpful for animals who live in cold climates, especially if they are small and are going to lose heat really rapidly to their environment. And it's also really critical for newborn babies. And that's because when we're first born, our muscles aren't mature enough to shiver. So we have brown fat all around our vital organs to keep us nice and toasty warm. So I study how baby mammals who live in different environments use their brown fat in different ways. And for my PhD work, I worked on the North American deer mouse. And this is a great model for understanding how animals live in different environments because the North American deer mouse lives everywhere on the continent, including in my basement here in Hamilton. But for my research, I'm interested in the mice who live here at the summit of the tallest mountains in the Rockies. And the baby deer mice who live here have evolved to use their brown fat in a really interesting way. In fact, when they get cold, they don't use it at all. They just let their body temperature drop. And that's really different from what the baby mice who live at lower elevations do. When they get cold, they use their brown fat, just like a baby human does, to keep their bodies warm. But Highlanders have evolved to shut their brown fat down, and we think they do this because they don't want to waste all of their precious body fat stores trying to stay warm. They just let their moms do all the work for them. But why should you care about these tiny little mountain mice and their freaky heat producing fat? Well, you should care because you have brown fat too. Or at least you have white fat cells that can sometimes act like brown fat. We didn't used to think that adult humans had any brown adipose tissue, but now we know that they do. And the more of these beige or brown fat cells that you have, the more metabolically healthy you tend to be. They don't seem to produce a lot of heat, but they do burn a lot of energy. And they can be protective against things like diet-induced obesity and diabetes. And so there's a lot of research focused now on trying to understand how healthy fat acts in our bodies under normal circumstances, whether it's white or beige or brown. And one of the things that we've learned is that fat is actually a really important endocrine organ. What this means is that our fat cells produce hormones, and those hormones communicate with all of the other tissues in our body. So while you've been sitting here listening to me talk, your fat cells have been sending out over 1,000 different types of messages that can regulate everything from your metabolism to how hungry you feel. Now, just because something sends out a lot of messages doesn't mean we understand what those messages mean. And for the most part, what these fat hormones do remain a mystery to us. We do know that they seem to be really important for metabolic health. So the mouse on the right is missing the hormone, that the gene to produce just one of these fat hormones. And this is especially true of the hormones produced in brown fat. And this is where our high altitude baby deer mice can come back into the picture. What we can do is we can move out of the lab and we can study wild animals who have evolved to use their brown fat and regulate it in different ways. We can study the hormones that they produce to try and give us an idea of what those messages actually mean. So if you take one thing from this talk, I hope it's that you understand now that your fat is a lot more complicated than we ever thought it was before. And that we can learn a lot about how our bodies work from studying weird little animals who live in strange places. And thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Cayleih, for teaching us about brown fat tissue. So I'd just like to introduce myself. I am Connie Imbo, and I'm the Program Manager and Research Coordinator for the McCall MacBain Postdoctoral Fellows Teaching and Leadership Program. And before we get into our next talk, I just wanted to ask you a question, Cayleih, that comes from the audience. And we wanted to know, how did you get started studying such a niche topic like baby animals?
Thanks, Connie. That's a really good question. When I first started getting into research, I actually wasn't interested in baby animals in particular. What I wanted to study was something called developmental plasticity. And that's the idea that the environmental conditions that we experience when we're little can have really long-term effects on our traits that we have as adults. And that's something that's been talked about for a really long time in fields like human behavior. We've debated nature versus nurture for hundreds of years. But when it comes to physiology, it's not really something that we're kind of way behind the game. And whether that's human physiology and how our early environment influences health and disease, or animal physiology and how early environment influences adult traits in the wild animals that we care about. And so that's kind of how I came about it in a roundabout way.
This is a question that comes directly from the audience. What makes brown fat brown?
Good question. So brown fat actually does look brown, and white fat looks white. And the reason for the color is the amount of fat oil droplets they have versus mitochondria. So white fat cells, those white adipocytes, are full of one giant droplet of oil, and it's the same color as like the olive oil that you have in your cabinet, and that's why they appear that color. But brown fat is full of mitochondria, and mitochondria are like a dark reddish brown color. And so that's what gives it its distinctive color. And that's actually how they produce heat as well.
One of our viewers asked, is carrying some body fat good for you? If so, how much fat would be considered good?
Very loaded question. So I'll preface it by saying that I'm not a human biologist or any sort of clinician. So I would never say a number of body composition that I think would be appropriate. And I think it varies from individual to individual. But yes, having body fat is really critical part of your health. One, we need fat to fuel a lot of the different metabolic processes in our body. And adipose tissue isn't the only place we store lipids. We have some inside of our muscle cells as well, but it is the primary place where we store them for fuel. And we also really need those fat-derived hormones. And so if you have really low body fat, and you can result in having really low production of those hormones, it can cause a lot of different health problems. Women will lose their menstrual cycle. It can have bone density problems, fertility. It has all kinds of off-target effects other than just kind of the metabolic side of things that we often consider.
Okay, thank you very much.